I want to thank you all so much for coming, as usual, so much for spending part of your time with us. Um, and so I want to talk about podcasting for B2B manufacturers. Really, I wanted to have this webinar and this discussion and bring on James Carbary from Sweetfish Media and Joe Sullivan, our CEO, because these guys really just do podcasting on such a high level. James owns a company who basically what they do is produce podcasts for companies. And it's not just SaaS companies, it's B2B companies. Let's just do some inside baseball here. They do the manufacturing executive, which is Joe's podcast. And they do an amazing job, and they really know how to make the business case for a podcast and make it reap a business outcome. So a little about us also, we're Gorilla 76. We help B2B manufacturers generate new business through marketing. James, introduce your company really quickly, and then I'll get into the agenda.
Yeah. So thanks, Matt. I'm really excited to be here. So I started Sweetfish in January of 2015. We were a content writing shop for the first year, and a year in, really saw what was happening with podcasts. Saw that companies were not embracing podcasts the way that we thought they should be, using the strategy that we had kind of figured out that was both a sales and a marketing play simultaneously through the channel of podcasting. So pivoted the agency in January of 2016 to being a podcast agency specifically for B2B brands. And we're just very fortunate. We got in ahead of a lot of folks starting to really realize the benefit of it. And we've been able to ride the wave. And I know tons of businesses have struggled through COVID. We are very fortunate in that podcasting seems to be booming when the world's kind of crumbling around. So just very fortunate, very blessed to be in the business that we're in. And it's a really exciting time for podcasting in general.
Oh my gosh, I think podcast is just blowing up exponentially. Just not just for like companies, but also personal podcasts as career lubricants. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So here's what I'm going to cover in this webinar today. We're going to talk just why podcasting, right? Like I'm sure you guys are thinking like, podcasting for me, for what I do. Let's actually, jam on that. Let's get into that. Let's talk about that, because I want to just, conquer that elephant in the room immediately. We'll talk about using them to drive a business result. I think one of the things that a lot of people think of when they think of podcasting is like it's expensive to get started. I want to show you guys ways to get started for less than $200, which you can if you want. You can also do it more high production and for more, but just ways to get started, real cheap, so you can prove the concept for yourself before you dive more all in on it. Formats and which is your fit. I think a lot of people think, well, how many different ways can you do a podcast? There's a ton. James knows this, and I'm going to let James talk to that. POV Discovery, content-based networking principles. These are things that James Carbary literally invented. That's why I brought James on the webinar to talk about this, to talk about POV Discovery and content-based networking. These are James's brainchildren. And so I'll let him jam on that as well. Tricks and hacks to get traction. So to show you guys, like once you're launched and once you're doing it, like, hey man, how do I actually get people to listen to my podcast? And then final thoughts, which is basically like, the overarching business goals you have in mind and how podcasting can help you accomplish those. And then Q&A. So I want you all please to ask questions about podcasting. No question is too basic, and honestly, there's no question that's too advanced either. So drop them in the chat. Let us know. I will bring them up to our panelists as we move forward here. And other than that, man, just enjoy the show, because you guys are going to learn a lot, and I'm going to learn a lot too, which has me excited. All right, so why podcasting? You guys see the bullet points, but honestly, James and Joe, I want to just kind of leave it to you guys, and I want you both to give your perspective on why podcasting for businesses.
Yeah, so I can start here, Joe. So for me, I really wanted to start doing a podcast because I had been doing one personally with a friend of mine. And I realized that no matter who I asked to be a guest on our show, they would always say yes. And I'm a very relational guy. I love building new friendships with people. And I just thought, oh my gosh, this thing is magical in that I can ask a complete stranger to be a guest on my show. And just because I have a podcast, and at the time it was a very unique thing. I think it's still a pretty unique thing to have a podcast, but back then, 5 or 6 years ago, it was very unique. And people said yes. And so I parlayed that into our agency and said, man, what if we're trying to go after a very specific type of buyer, what if we branded a show around that buyer persona and we asked that person to be a guest on the show to talk about their challenges, their expertise. Would this still work? Would they still say yes? And I was very pleasantly surprised whenever they did. And so we sent an email campaign to 100 people in a very niche ICP, and 80% of them responded to that cold email. And I had no prior relationship with these people whatsoever. And I don't know how many of you guys have done cold outreach, but getting an 80% reply rate, not an open rate, but a reply rate on a cold outbound campaign blew my mind. And so I thought, that was the big why for me in terms of getting started with it.
I'll chime in from my perspective. I'm looking across the list of people who are attendees today. I see a few clients on here. I see some people whose names I recognize because I know they get our emails regularly or maybe interact with me or people from our company on LinkedIn. And for those of you who know me at all, I'm one of the co-owners of Gorilla, and I've been writing content. The written word has been my medium for many years. Our industrial marketing strategy blog. I think over the last 2 years, I've published like 60,000 words of content, and that's just for me. And you look across the rest of our company, there's lots more. And it was probably a year or two ago when I said I really want to take this content and all these concepts that are sort of in my brain and have been put in writing and figure out how to sort of humanize our brand a little bit more. And so I started looking at some different media. We as you know from being on this webinar, our webinars have been one way for us to do that. But the podcast felt like a really natural way for me to do that in a way where you can hear my voice because we conduct all of our interviews in the same way we're doing it now via Zoom. You get a video recording, and then we get video content we can use in the social channels from that in little micro formats and full episodes published on YouTube. And so for me, a lot of this was about I'm writing all this stuff already. I've written all this stuff already. It only makes sense to look at how are people starting to consume information in my audience these days. And that's overwhelmingly shifting to video and also audio. And so for me, it kind of started as how do I get more legs out of all the content I'm producing. And then, James's company, Sweetfish, we hired them to produce our show. So I book my guests, I conduct my interviews, but we throw the audio file to them and they turn it into something. And it's just been, it's already opened my eyes to the concepts that James has talked about. Like I've connected with authors of best-selling sales books and software companies, manufacturing CEOs. And our show is called The Manufacturing Executive. I've connected with CEOs of shows. I've connected with presidents of huge, industry organizations in the manufacturing world. And so it's a very easy way, like James said, to not only potential future customers, but people who are influencers in the space we're trying to reach, opening doors. So many benefits I've seen already.
Why do you guys think it's so much easier? James, you talked about how you got an 80% open rate or response rate in this email. Why is it so much easier to get someone to appear on your podcast as opposed to asking that same question and saying, hey, do you want to be a guest on my webinar? Which people would go, oh no, I don't have time for that. But people were like, podcast, yeah, sure, I'll do that. What's the difference in delivery that make people more willing to do a podcast than supposedly more high effort content based?
So I think there's probably with a podcast, there's an assumption that there's going to be some post-production done on that. So it's not a live call. And so they can trip all over themselves, or they can say something stupid and then say, hey, make sure to cut that. Don't let, that never happens. Actually, very rarely does that ever happen. But I think the perception is that they're not going to be well spoken, or that they're going to need something that they've said to be edited on the back end. So that would be one reason why I think asking someone to be on a podcast instead of a webinar would be where there would be a plus there. The other thing though, Matt, that I think instead of thinking about it like podcast versus a webinar, what we see so many companies wanting to do with, especially with cold outbound, the ask that they're making is, it's not clear that there is value in it for the person they're reaching out to. The email is about, hey, can I demo you our product? Or can I it's very clear that they want to sell them something.
Mm-hmm.
But whenever you make an ask that is inherently about them, whether it's featuring them on a webinar, in a video series, in a podcast, the content medium really, to me, doesn't matter. It's the psychology of, hey, I want to feature you in some content that we're creating. I think it's easy for people to understand that, oh, this is of benefit to me. Even if the audience isn't necessarily my company's ideal buyers, this is me getting to showcase my expertise and what I know a lot about. And even if it's not necessarily a huge win for my company, it's going to be a huge win for me personally, because I can then share this piece of content on my LinkedIn profile. I can show it to my boss. And so this is going to make me look good. And that's ultimately why I think what we call content-based networking is effective, because it's very, it strokes egos. And not that that's the only reason to do it by any means, but I think people can just see why being on a show or being in some sort of content is beneficial for them. And so many sales teams that are reaching out, trying to book demos, they think, oh, well, our product is the value that you're going to get, but it's not perceived. The product isn't perceived value. The product is, oh, you're trying to sell me something. So of course you think it's valuable because you're trying to sell it to me, but the perception on the other end is not that it's valuable. It's seen as annoying. Whereas when you ask somebody to create some content with you, it's perceived very differently.
Gotcha. So a couple of things to wrap this up real quick, because I want to keep this moving. So the passive relationship building and intimate content format of podcasting, I think, is something that should not be understated. Because when you think about ways people listen to stuff or watch stuff, like, you can listen to a podcast in a way that you can't do any other piece of content out there. Okay. You can listen to a podcast while you mow your grass. You can listen to it on an airplane. You can listen to it while you're taking a walk with your dog, right? You can't do any of that. You can't read a blog necessarily, or even watch a YouTube video kind of with the same sort of passive listening and sort of recall, right? So I think that's something that should not be understated, is just how easy and portable podcasts are as a content medium compared to some of the other ones out there that you have at your disposal. And then there's also people like to hear people. There's like this passive relationship building. The more they hear you talk about something with authority and with a semblance of expertise, like you know what you're talking about, the more they're going to trust you, especially when you talk to them sort of the first time. I mean, we all three of us have a podcast here who's talking right now. And all three of us, like, we have a certain level of trust with people now when we talk to other people. So like, hey, I heard episodes on your podcast, and then sounds like you know what you're talking about. And we have no relationship with these people. They just talk to us and they're like, I've heard you and you sound like you know what you're doing. And it's because of doing stuff like the podcast, where you have this way of passively building relationships with people. And I think that's something that cannot be understated enough, in my opinion. So Julian had this question, and it's actually going to be right here on this slide. And that's about selling the podcast to your executive level, going to your president or your CEO and saying, hey, man, I want to do this podcast. I want both of you guys are both CEOs, right? So you guys are the ones who would be fielding this question and having to answer it. What would you want to hear, or what would matter to you in terms of, like, using your podcast to drive a business result?
Joe, do you want to kick this one off?
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk about it, because I've had this more on the convincing end with some of our own clients who maybe feel, our clients are manufacturing people, and this concept of podcasting sounds intimidating to a lot of them, frankly, because it's something new. They've probably used a lot more, many more traditional media in the past than a podcast. And, I think some of the things that make so much sense about it, that I think can be selling points, are it's sort of like the way you can repackage and repurpose so many things from a podcast. And like, I compare it to a blog post. Like a lot of our clients have written content, and, producing a really well written blog post, it requires research, it requires writing, it requires editing, and, probably some more research and more editing. And it's a long process to get to a written piece. And there's plenty of value in that. I'm not trying to diminish the value of a written piece, but when you start with a podcast, it's often a conversation, and you're often, you have an expert or somebody interviewing an expert who could talk about stuff all day. There are ums and ahs. Sure, you might sneeze in the middle of it, whatever. It's like it's human, right? It's just a human interaction. And after that natural conversation, you come away with the opportunity to produce. You could produce a long written piece from that. You could produce probably 3 short written pieces from it. You could break it down into little bits and pieces of content that you can distribute elsewhere. So one 30-minute conversation with somebody can turn into a whole, James, you were the first one I saw use the term like waterfall of content that just sort of falls out of it. That shouldn't be a hard thing to sell if you can position it that way, that it's not just, rather than doing these one-off pieces, we're going to do these big pillar pieces that we can create all kinds of stuff from and have you be able to distribute that across many different media. So that's kind of one of the main selling points for me. James, how about you?
So I think what I would want to hear is not just the benefit of building trust with listeners and the people consuming the content, because there's business results that happen from people hearing your episodes week after week or day after day, depending on what the cadence is of your show. Because I immediately get skeptical about like, yeah, but how many people are actually going to listen to this thing? It's on this very niche topic. Are enough people going to listen to it for it to actually drive a business result? And so that's where why I think podcasting is so powerful is it's not just about the audience and the relationship you can build with an audience. It is about the one-to-one relationship that you can build with decision makers at your target accounts. So I think if you're talking to your CEO and you're saying, hey, we have our 100 target accounts that, myself as the marketing leader and our sales leader are aligned on. What if we had this medium that would allow us to go to specific people at these 100 companies and ask them to be a guest on the show because we've branded the show around the industry and not about our own expertise? I think me as a CEO, I go, okay, that makes a lot of sense to me, because regardless of whether 6 people or 600 people listen to this, if it still allows us to a foot in the door with decision makers at our target accounts, then it's worth at least experimenting to see if it can drive results in terms of revenue.
Right. I think to wrap that up is also a great way to get customer research and insight. I think so many marketers really struggle to get this. They're like, I don't understand my customer. Like we do customer interviews, Joe, it's part of our thing. And it's astounding, like what we learn about our clients' customers by just talking to them in a format that's very similar to a podcast, to be quite frank with you. You talk to them about their job, what their challenges are, what their jobs to be done are, what their priorities are, what's going well, what's not. And like, it's amazing what you learn about your customer when you talk to them like that. And you get to basically flip that into a new product offering, repositioning your copy, like all those customer insights you get from just talking to people on your podcast. The armor's really off when you have them on to do that. And I think that the ability to gather insight at that rate and speed and with that sort of honesty is powerful stuff for you to use even beyond the benefit of the interview. You're able to take that back to your product manager, engineering, your sales team. I think those are all very useful things. You learn a lot about your customer. I think that it's hard to get through this filter of your sales team, or even if you go visit them sometimes, just one-to-one.
We've formalized that, Matt. So we actually came up with 15 questions that we ask independent of the podcast itself. And so it's either on the front end, either in the post interview after we've stopped recording the actual interview, or we do it before. But coming up with those 10 to 15 questions that you think the market would be curious to know. and then asking every guest, like just as part of the pre or post interview, like, hey, we're doing some original research in the industry. Would love to ask you these 10 questions. We've never had anybody tell us no. They've already said yes to being on the show. So it's a great way to just get even more juice from the squeeze of having a show when you bake in a formalized kind of research and insight, separate piece of content baked into the podcast itself. Doesn't even have to be included in the episode, but it's going to be enormously helpful, like you said, to your internal team, as well as can turn into a fantastic campaign for your content marketing efforts as well.
Right. And like the other thing about it that I think is really interesting is if you have a current customers that you want to like fortify relationships with, bringing them onto your podcast is a great way to further that, get people more sort of ingrained and get to know you more. And also if you're a marketer and you're like, man, I really need to get some case studies, some testimonials, great way to introduce yourself to that person you want that case study or testimonial from is to bring them on your podcast and get that warm intro so you can go back to them and say, hey, really enjoyed talking to you. I know you've been a long time customer. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to take this a step further at that point, because once you kind of make them make that first commitment to you, that second commitment becomes a lot easier to make. So I always think of podcasts also as like a lever to get additional things for yourself down the road, which I think is also something useful and powerful to consider. All right, so I wanted to talk, I promised ways to get started for under $200. And so I'm not gonna, I am a man of my word on this. And so I'll go really quickly through this. So James and Joe do this professionally. I do not. I do this thing for rock bottom. Okay. Like I have a personal podcast and I'm not paid to do my podcast. It's not part of my business. And so when I wanted to get mine started in March, I was like, okay, I don't want to spend a lot of money to get this started. So I got a Yeti microphone. And then I literally so Anchor.fm, I'll have all these resources, by the way, at the end of the slide deck, is where you can basically upload your podcast to get it on Apple and to get it on Spotify. It's free and it's super easy to use. I edit all the audio in iMovie, which is the little purple star down there. And I started out recording stuff in Zoom. So I would just record stuff in Zoom, throw the audio in iMovie, edit it up, and then upload it to Anchor. And basically all these things are free except for the microphone. The mic's the only thing you actually pay for. So if you want a way to get started for under $200, this is how you would get it done. And then if you want to level up and use a tool like Zencaster or get something like Libsyn or a different kind of podcast hosting platform, you can. But for anyone who's listening and wants to try to prove the concept for basically nothing, these are the tools that you'll use to get started, these four. And I'll have links to all of those at the end of the slide. James or Joe, do you want to add anything on trying to get this thing started on a budget, or do you want to just move on?
Yeah, one tool that I'll share, Matt, is Descript. So Descript.com. I think it's really affordable, but you can edit the audio through text, through the transcript. So you can literally, by deleting sentences, or if you're like, man, that entire chunk of the interview, I just want to cut, you can cut the text in the transcript and it will actually edit the audio. So it's really innovative technology. And I think it's really affordable as well.
Nice. Cool. All right, so let's talk podcast formats, because I think we've talked podcasting. We've been making the big sort of ask on like, all right, here's why podcasting, here's how you can leverage it. Now let's talk about the ways you can do podcasts, because I think there's actually formats to this that people don't know or aren't maybe aware of. So both of you kind of talked a little bit about these formats, which ones you enjoy the most and why.
So I can start by talking about specifically the behind the curtain format that you guys see on the screen right now. So we used to do our entire show. Our podcast is called B2B Growth, and all we did were that top bullet, right? Standard interview with an expert, and we were talking to decision makers at our target accounts about B2B marketing, and we were probably, I don't know, maybe 400 or 500 episodes in. And I just got a wild hair one day and was like, you know what? I'm learning something that I think our audience might be interested in. And so I just did a little episode. I called it Behind the Curtain. And it was this kind of peek behind the curtain of our business, and didn't really think anything of it, uploaded it, and looked back a couple weeks later and noticed that Behind the Curtain episode had been downloaded twice as much. I think we were getting around 1,500 downloads an episode at that time. And I'd noticed that one episode got downloaded right at 3,000 times. And I thought, oh man, this is really, really interesting. So we started doing more behind the curtain episodes where we were just taking a peek behind the curtain of our own business and what we were learning and how we were growing. And I think what I learned from that is that our listeners want variety, and they don't want to, I think I was worried to deviate from that kind of standard interview with an expert format. But then when I thought about it personally, I enjoy shows that switch it up, and it's not just the same thing over and over and over again, week after week or day after day. And so it made sense to me, like, oh, of course. And I think I think our listeners were hungry to know more about us as hosts of the show. We have multiple hosts of B2B Growth. And so that Behind the Curtain series allowed us to do both of those things, vary up the content, as well as kind of give a peek behind the curtain of the business, letting them know more about how we think and what our thinking was as hosts of the show. And just from downloads alone, it was clear that format really resonated.
How about you, Joe? I know you switched it up too with the manufacturing executive. Tell me a little bit about that. What makes you switch the format up, and then how do they both complement each other?
Sure. So probably 3 out of every 4 episodes, or maybe even more at this point, but are the standard interview with an expert, which takes on a lot of different types of experts, I guess. But one thing I've done, and this is partially because, or I guess mostly because, like I said earlier, I've written so many of my own insights over the last 5-10 years, and a lot of those have performed really well from just feedback I've received and just the way the content's been consumed in written form. So I've picked some of those, highlights and done solo casts. I'll look at the things that, were our most opened and clicked through emails. And we have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks on Wednesdays. There'll be one coming out this Wednesday. Probably a lot of you on this call will get that. It's purely just insightful in nature. It's usually sharing a written piece, and I'll look at which ones perform the best, which ones got opened and clicked through the most, which pages on our site or articles on our site were consumed the most, where, when I take little excerpts of that and post those on LinkedIn, which ones are getting a lot of interaction and positive comments, and people are clearly invested in the conversation around it. And so I've taken some of those and turned them into solo casts, where what I've really done is I've just taken, I've thrown the blog post up on screen, I've pulled out, maybe 5 or 10 talking points, just turned them into bullets. And then I just sat here, I turned on Zoom with just me, and I hit record. And as opposed to reading it, which I think is going to, when it comes off as scripted, I feel like it's maybe feels a lot less authentic. I'll just think through the bullet points, which are frankly things I've talked about so many times. So I think that's a really, it's an interesting idea for any of you who have maybe already published thought leadership content, whether it's written or you've done webinars like this, or it's just you're a salesperson and you're always sharing these same presentations. Like, the things you say there could make for a really good solo cast. So I like to sprinkle those in, and those have been some of the highest performing episodes in terms of downloads from ours as well. So you kind of need to look at it and see, are people actually consuming this stuff, and are you getting good feedback?
I want to add a question here, and I want to actually bring it to you guys, because this is something that I'm sure a lot of people are going to run into, especially if you're a marketer at an industrial company and you want to maybe try this. What if my reps are hesitant of me talking to their customers? How do I get them on board? I have an answer to this, but I want to hear you guys first.
I would say you make them a co-host of the show.
Yes, that's exactly my answer.
So I think a lot of people, have a very myopic view of podcasting, and they think that a show can only have one host. Just to give folks a little bit of context here, B2B Growth is a top 100 marketing podcast in Apple Podcasts. We get 150,000 downloads every month, and we've got 19 different co-hosts of B2B Growth. So I hope I say that to just break kind of what we think is supposed to be the case with podcasting. I think a lot of people just assume you can only have one host of a show, and we've broken that mold, and it's proved to be very successful for us. So I think you could have multiple people on your team co-hosting episodes, I think you could jump on the episode with somebody, with one of your reps, or you could just have them do the episode on their own. I think there's lots of different ways to structure it, but that would be my answer there.
I totally agree. I think having multiple hosts is great. It also, you can bring your own people internally on as guests just to sell them on first. But like, hey, why don't you come on as a guest first? And then if you like it, maybe when I get someone in your territory to come on, you can just come on and just be a co-host with me. And then you can throw them questions. We'll format it up, send it to them, list the 8 questions, and then we'll just kind of let the conversation ride. But that's exactly what I would do. I would just invite them on and say, look, man, I'm going to get you one-on-one time with this person in an intimate format, and you're going to get a chance to understand your customer in a way that you probably would never try to understand them if you went to go knock on their door and visit them, because your goal would be to sell at that point, right? Yep. And so you're basically giving them this whole other way and format and to get to know your customer, that they'll be able to deepen that relationship with them. You'll be able to understand more what's important to those buyers, and they'll actually have a better opinion of you, because they'll go, wow, they actually are interested in me as an engineer, or me as someone who builds this product, not me as someone who they want to buy their product, right? Yes. It's a completely different vantage point of doing content. And I think that's the most powerful thing about podcasts. All right, so let's talk POV discovery. James, this is very much you. So I want to kind of cede the floor to you here a little bit here. I want you to talk on POV discovery, because this, honestly, for people listening to this is how you essentially format the bones of your podcast, right? This is basically your podcast strategy, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go through this so people understand how to do this if they want to execute.
Yeah. So POV discovery, it stands for point of view discovery. And so what I've found is that the content that resonates the most with me, the reason I consume so much Gary Vee content, the reason I resonate with really anybody's content, is because they have a clear and distinct point of view. They're not just rattling off something that everybody else in the industry has already said a million times before. They actually have a clear and distinct point of view. Well, how do you actually figure out what that is for you? So that covers kind of the why. Why is it important? I think it's important because you want your content to stand out. You want it to be genuinely helpful. You want it to be seen as not just, oh, they're another voice saying the same thing that I've already heard a million times before. You want it to be distinct. You want it to stand out. You want people to trust it and trust you. And I think having a clear POV does that. So how do you implement it? I've found that there are lots of different questions that you can ask yourself, but the 3 that tend to work best, and this can work for yourself if you're doing a solo episode, or it can work with your guest if you're interviewing experts. If you ask one of the 3 questions that you see as a sub bullet on the screen right now, that first one it works really, really well. What's a commonly held belief in your industry that you passionately disagree with? The reason I think this one works so well is because you're almost forcing the person or yourself, depending on who you're asking the question, to take a contrarian belief. And when you're scrolling, I don't know how many of you watching this are on LinkedIn a lot, but I noticed that a lot of the content that tends to explode on LinkedIn, it's somebody taking a contrary, they're saying something that goes against the grain of what most people think. And the example that I use a lot here, let's say that if I hear somebody tell me, as a marketer, if I hear somebody tell me that sales and marketing need to be aligned, I'm just going to kind of roll my eyes. And because I've heard that said a million times before, sales and marketing needs to be aligned. But it could absolutely be somebody's point of view that sales and marketing don't need to be aligned. And that would be, my ears would perk if that were somebody's POV. I would want them to explain more. Wait a minute, why don't you want sales and marketing to be aligned? And so the way this question is worded allows your guest or yourself to surface what are those things that I think are that everybody believes that I think are actually wrong. And so that's a great question. The second 2 are very similar. What's something that people in your industry should start doing? And what's something that people in your industry should stop doing? The reason I like these questions is because they force you to figure out a topic for your episode that is action oriented, that will help your listener actually start doing something or stop doing something, and they can change the way they are doing things currently. So it's very actionable, and I tend to deeply resonate with content that is actionable. So that's POV Discovery in a nutshell. And I think if every one of your episodes is built around a strong POV, then you're going to have content that really resonates with the folks consuming it.
Joe, I want to put you on the spot here. So you have the manufacturing executive. You have a podcast for manufacturing executives based on them. I want to kind of have you go through your own POV discovery here a little bit. I didn't plan for this for the show, but let's. I kind of want to just put you on the spot here and just have you guys. I want to go through POV with you. So can you tell me a little bit about your approach when you're doing the manufacturing executive, about maybe going through one of these three, like a commonly held belief that you disagree with, or something people should start or stop doing?
Okay, good question. So do you want me to try to frame this in terms of, my show as a whole, or when I'm looking at a specific episode?
I think your show specifically. I mean, I think you speak to a lot of the people that people who are on this webinar are going to want to talk to. So I want you to kind of go through that process so they can reframe it through their own filter.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. So, in the manufacturing space, we've been working with manufacturers for, 8 or 10 years, very intensively. And, on the marketing front, things tend to be, it's always been a lot of trade shows. It's always been, print advertising, manufacturing has been fairly unsophisticated on the marketing front, not so much on the sales front. And what I wanted to do with the show is, it's not a show just about marketing, but I wanted to bring new ways of thinking about how to grow your business that are not just the same way you've been doing things for many years. A lot of our clients are second, third generation family-owned, manufacturers that have just always done stuff the same thing. And the world of technology is changing fast, and especially on the marketing and sales front. And then COVID has only, sped things up this year. So that's kind of, the platform I've taken, or, trying to help manufacturers look differently at all these things that they've been sort of doing the same way for many years.
Sure. I think the trade show point you make is actually a great instructive thing to bring to light here a little bit, because when you think about how people will usually talk one-to-one, it would be at an open house or like a small trade show. Well, now you can basically accelerate that capability for yourself by just talking to them on your podcast. And not only do you have them one-to-one, you also don't compete with all the other booths that you kind of have around you to have that intimate conversation with them about something that's going on with them at their job, something that they're seeing in their industry, something that you're noticing as an overarching trend that they don't agree with. You get to have that conversation and they basically not compete for their time or their stimulus. So I think that's just one thing I didn't want to overlook, that example that you brought. I'm not anti-trade show, but I'm just saying, like, there's other more efficient ways to get in front of them in that intimate kind of format.
And you have to, now you have to. Like it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you have to. I mean, it's not going away, right? I mean, trade shows are not coming back. Probably first half of next year, at least. So content-based networking, this is also you, James, and I want to give you the floor to kind of explain this. I don't know if you have two. No. I want you to explain this a little bit, kind of in detail, how this works for people.
Yeah. So very, very quick story on this, Matt. So in 2008, my roommate's brother-in-law won a sweepstakes, one of those things you see a commercial on TV from a phone company called Altel. It was like, text football to 55224 and you can win an all expense trip for you and 9 of your friends to a professional football game of your choice. And you see that and you're like, nobody ever actually wins those. Well, my roommate's brother-in-law won it. I got to be one of those 9 guys that he invited to be a part of that trip. So we took a private jet to New York City, watched a Giants Cowboys game in a suite next to Jerry Jones, got to watch the game with Barry Sanders. It was this unreal experience. And there was a guy on that trip. He was managing all of the logistics for the travel. So he was on site with us, making sure that we got from point A to point B, that our police escort that was kind of toting our bus around all day, escorting our bus around all day, knew where they were going. And I hit it off with this guy. His name was Jeff. And we just started talking about faith. We talked about family. We talked about business. And at the end of the day, obviously, like an insane day, a day that none of us ever thought we would have. This guy gives me his business card, and so I gave him my email, and I was like, okay, I would love to stay connected with this guy, because he as it turns out, was the owner of the logistics company that Alltel had hired for the sweepstakes. And so fast forward, he ends up asking me to join his company about a year and a half later. And so I moved from a small town right outside of Oklahoma City to Orlando, Florida. And I got to run the helicopter division of his logistics company for the next 3 years. And that single relationship with Jeff that I built very serendipitously on that trip ended up transforming my entire life. So because of working for Jeff and seeing an entrepreneur operate a business firsthand, it inspired me toward pursuing entrepreneurship. And then it put me into a city. That relationship with Jeff moved me to Orlando, which is where I met my wife. So I can't imagine ever having crossed paths with Lisa apart from this interaction with Jeff and him moving me to Orlando. And so when I thought about how one relationship can have such a transformative impact on our lives, it made me think, well, how do we, instead of depending solely on serendipity, which is how I think a lot of people do it. I think a lot of people know that relationships can map to transformational results, both personally and professionally. But I don't think very many of us think like, well, how do we actually reverse engineer relationships with people that can have that kind of impact on us? And so that was really the question that I asked, that led me down this path of figuring out content-based networking. And what content-based networking is essentially doing content collaborations with the people you want to know. It could be a podcast interview. It could be interviewing them for a video series you're doing on LinkedIn. It could be interviewing them even for a blog series. If you're just wanting to, keep the written word. I still think Joe could have done content-based networking even had he stayed focused just on blogging. I don't think it necessarily has to be a podcast that you do content-based networking with. But this process of collaborating with people to create content with them as a means to build a relationship with somebody, as opposed to just saying, man, I hope I run into that person at a trade show, or I hope somehow that our paths cross. Now, instead, you can say, no, I want to meet this person or this type of person. I'm going to come up with a content theme, whether it's a podcast or figure out the format, whether it's a podcast, a blog, video series, whatever. And then I'm going to go reach out to these people and ask them to collaborate with me on a piece of content. And in doing so, you end up building these very genuine, authentic relationships that can map to huge results. So whether it's with referral partners, whether it's with, in my case, it was potential customers. When we started B2B growth, that was my goal. So I wrote a book about this concept, and the three big sections of the book are, the first one is you got to get clear on your goal. What are you trying to accomplish? So for me, I was trying to get new business. Then you've got to get real clear on who are the types of people that I want to create a relationship with. And that is, who is the type of person that can help me accelerate toward my goal? And then what's the content that I can create with those people? I think a lot of people screw up this strategy when they try to make the content about their own expertise or what they know a lot about, instead of making it about the person that you're trying to connect with. What is their expertise? So for us, had we started the B2B podcasting show, that would have been our expertise. We're experts in B2B podcasts, but none of our potential customers know the first thing about B2B podcasting. So when we went to, if we were to ask them to be on the B2B podcasting show, they would all say no, because none of them have that expertise. And so I see people make that misstep a lot. And so instead we branded the show around their expertise. We're asking VPs of marketing at B2B SaaS companies with 50 to 500 employees to be a guest on our show. What are they experts in? They're experts in B2B growth. And that can cover a lot of different topics. And so yeah, that's content-based networking in a nutshell. And I think why it works goes back to what we talked about earlier in this webinar. It works because you're giving someone value that is completely independent of your product. You're giving them value of being able to articulate their thoughts, package up their thoughts and ideas in a format that makes them look awesome. It makes them look really smart to their boss, to their customers, to their team. And so because of that, because it is inherently valuable to them, they're going to say yes, and they're going to want to engage with you. And then it allows you to reach people in mass. So not only do you now have a relationship with that one person, but you've also been able to nurture the relationship passively with all the people that are listening to your show or consuming whatever content type you're creating, whether it's a video series, blog, or podcast.
So I want to actually bring this to even further. I actually want to kind of spin it into my own experience, my own podcast, because what you said, your transformative experience that got you the job at Alltech, that happened to me with Gorilla. So I basically started a podcast in March with MJ. I've never met MJ in my life, MJ Peters. MJ and I connected on LinkedIn. We decided to start a podcast on industrial marketing because we just wanted to start one. We wanted to test the format out, see how it worked. And Joe was our third guest on the show, I believe. And I never met Joe before I had Joe on my podcast. And I want to say this because you don't have to just start a podcast for your company. Like if you see an angle or a space to just go out and do it on your own, that's part of the reason why I wanted to show you guys how to do it for less than $200. You can do that. And I brought Joe on to our podcast. I never met or talked to Joe in my life. He came on for talk for an hour about marketing in the industrial space and how industrial and manufacturing companies can use marketing in a more efficient and more effective way. And from there, I stayed in touch with Joe for like 5 months, 6 months, and it ended up spawning into a job opportunity with Gorilla. I didn't bring Joe on with the intention of ever working for Gorilla. I really just wanted to talk to him because I thought he'd be a great guest and he'd be valuable to my audience. And so I had a lot of curiosity. But we ended up just kind of staying in touch afterwards, passively, right? We kind of passively just built that relationship. Yeah. And then when the opportunity came where I was looking to transition out of the role I was in, I reached out to Joe just to say, hey, man, I'm not looking for a job from you, but do you know anyone, any of your clients who maybe are looking? And that one appearance in the podcast in March basically transpired into that ask, which was, very much not expecting anything in return from Joe, ended up becoming like, I'm actually looking for someone and wondering if you'd be willing to talk about it. And so that's kind of the magic power of this format, which I think like there's so many anecdotes and sort of qualitative examples of how podcasting can really drive a huge personal and business impact that it's not something that you're going to be looking through in your funnel or in your attribution model. It's really comes down to the qualitative things benefits that come out of it that you notice. And so I wanted to bring that story in as well, because I just think that's a really powerful example of how that can work for people who are maybe listening to this webinar right now.
Yeah. You've called it, Matt, a
career
lubricant.
Yeah.
I love that. I've never heard anybody frame it that way, but I absolutely think it could work that way. I share stories in the book about how, if you're coming out of college and you have no clue, it's everybody says it's not what you know, it's who you know. But it's like, well, how do you get to know the who's that you need to know? And I think, coming out of college, if you've got an industry in mind that you're interested in, going and interviewing everybody in that industry, and if you do 25 episodes of your show with different people in that industry, there's a very good chance that by the end of that exercise, you're going to have enough relationships that are ultimately going to get you on at a company. Maybe it's not with their company in particular, but it's so much of life and business comes down to who we know and who are our friends. And I don't think we use the term friendship enough in business. And I'm trying to change that, because I think doing stuff like content-based networking allows you to build genuine friendships with people. You can't go into it. I think it would have been different, Matt, had you gone to Joe with the intent of trying to get a job there, and not necessarily that couldn't be your intent, but it's oftentimes very easy to sniff out whether someone's doing something for ill intent. So if your intent were maybe one day down the road you need to get a job, which I know it wasn't. If you were not really focused on making Joe look like a rock star in that interview, if you'd have made it feel like a very like, oh man, this feels icky, which a lot of salespeople have a tendency to do whenever they're interviewing decision makers at their target accounts on the show. It's like clear that this is just a disguised discovery call. You're not actually trying to create a good piece of content with me, which is again why POV Discovery is so important. It really helps positions you as a journalist and positions you as someone that actually cares about the content of the show and not just somebody that's trying to trick you into getting on a discovery call. At the end of the day, that stuff just doesn't work. People can see right through it, and it's gonna do irreparable damage to your brand of your company and your personal brand if you go about it that way. So I think because your intent was pure and you really did want to highlight Joe's expertise, it ultimately made him like you. And
yeah, exactly it. I mean, he basically he knew me, he liked me, he had some trust in me because we went back and forth for a little while beforehand anyway. And it worked. It was kind of this amazing serendipitous relational moment that happens to all of us professionally. Everyone who's listening to this, like you've gotten a big break in your life somewhere down the road because of someone you know who liked you and knew you. And this is basically a way to accelerate that for yourself, whether that's personally or in your business.
Exactly. Right.
Julian has a question, and I want to bring this because it goes back to the executive and the leadership position. What are goals I can set for myself or leadership with podcasting, and then how do you know it's working? And I don't think what is meant there necessarily is how do you measure success, but how do you know this is working for you? And you both do this in a business context. My goals are less because it's a personal podcast, so I'm interested very much in, like, I have 100 people who listen to my podcast consistently, and so I'm interested in like that those 100 people like getting a lot of value out of it. But maybe if you're a business, maybe you demand a little bit more. So can you guys speak a little bit to those goals that you guys set for yourselves?
Sure, I'll speak to it from Guerrilla's perspective. So, my primary goal with our show, the Manufacturing Executive, is to build consistent thought leadership, and that's that particular element of it is less tangible. But we find ways to, create more tangible metrics out of it as well. So, we have talked a little bit about how we'll take little bits and pieces of our episodes and use them elsewhere. Well, I'll say we've given Julian and Matt, our two senior strategists who run this webinar, like they've got a budget to take little bits and pieces of our Manufacturing Executive as well as this show and promote them on LinkedIn to people who have these job titles from these types of companies and these characteristics. And so there's measurable elements that come out of all of that, which you can look at and say, okay, well, this little 3-minute segment that we used as essentially a paid ad was viewed by X amount of people at 75% of the video, and like that tells me there's some engagement there and that there's something people are grasping onto. So there's that. There's we generate. I mean, geez, Matt, Julian, you guys have got 150 some people, I think, right, that are registered for this on an ongoing basis. 150 people, like not the same people show up every week, but that's some serious engagement to have people here. And I use this isn't a podcast, but it's the same idea, right? It's another form. So I think that that's my perspective on it. It's if we keep doing this stuff and we are in front of the right people and we are there just educating them and helping them with the stuff we know they care about, because we talk to these, we talk to manufacturing folks every day, the good things are going to come from it. So
anything you want to add there, James?
And I think a goal that people could set for themselves. I say that B2B podcasting, if account-based marketing and content marketing had a baby together, it would be B2B podcasting. I think you could set goals around. I think you could set goals that that you would typically set around content marketing, and you could measure the podcast success against those goals. Yeah. But I also think your ABM goals, your account-based marketing goals, like how many conversations did we have with decision makers at target accounts as a result of having them as a guest on the show? It becomes very quantifiable, because you can just, if you do the show for a year and you're doing a weekly show, that's 52 episodes you've done. How many of those episodes were we featuring a decision maker at a target account? And then you can look and see, hey, have we made progress on getting, on doing business with that with that particular prospective customer. And so that's one way from a revenue perspective to tangibly measure. And what you'll find is you don't need, especially for the kind of folks the folks that are listening to this, just knowing a little bit, Matt, from what you told me about before, the lifetime value of a customer for folks watching this is significant. It's, you're not selling a $25 widget. You're selling things that are, six-figure deal sizes. So if one of your 52 guests ends up mapping to revenue for you, it more than covers the cost of the creation of all that content that's helping you reach your content marketing goals. If just one of your guests ends up turning into a customer, it's covered all of the cost plus some. And so I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
And that'd be true if you had like a $50,000, if the one customer's were 50K or 25K. And I know for a lot of people who are listening to this and you're in the manufacturing space, those relationships are long lasting, right? Like those companies make that decision and you're there for like 3, 4, 5, 6 years, sometimes even longer. Like the value of that customer is almost exponential once you get them in the door. Yeah. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think that's really, to me, powerful. And again, like I also look at it compared to like the effort you have to put in for other content, right? Like, let's say you've been blogging your entire life. Like blogging is kind of like, that's what everyone does. Let's do that. Well, let's say you're not a great writer, right? But maybe you're a better talker. Like how many hours do you spend writing a blog post once a week? Maybe you spend 3 or 4 hours. You could probably record 2 or 3 episodes of a podcast instead and probably distribute it the exact same way you're doing right now, which is via email, or maybe it's on your company LinkedIn. And I guarantee you could get more people to listen to your podcast for 20 minutes than spend 8 minutes reading your blog post that you probably spend a lot of effort getting into that most people aren't interested in taking the time to read. So I would compare the podcast to what other content efforts are you doing and what kind of result are you getting out of it, right? Isn't that, I mean, I think it's always important to think about, well, what am I doing right now and how good is it working for me, right?
Yes. I think you're spot on.
All right, so tips and hacks to get started real quick. So relationship building, successful launch, micro contenting. We've talked a lot about waterfall content. I don't think we need to talk about that. I want to talk about the launch, okay? And Julian, we have another question here about if you're starting one from scratch today, what would you do? What would you do for sure? What would you put up until later? And let's actually dovetail that into the launch. So tell me a little bit about a successful launch. How do you structure that? How do you get people to actually listen to your podcast when you launch it? I want to give both of you. You've both done this successfully. I want you both to give these tips.
Do you want to kick it off, Joe?
No, I'm going to let you kick it off because you helped us launch our podcast. So I think you go. I'll add color where I can.
Yeah. So I think, so in terms of a successful launch, I know that some of the key metrics that Apple Podcasts specifically looks at, they look at the quality of your cover art. That's something that I don't know what their algorithm is for measuring, whether cover art is quality or not, but I know the cover art that stands out to me, and that as I look at the podcasts that Apple Podcast is featuring as like a top show in the space, they have some similarities. And one of the similarities is that there's typically a bold background color or it's a solid color as a background. It's not just a white background. So we used to, and this was a mistake that we made with a lot of customers, honestly, for the first couple of years that we were producing shows, we didn't really pay a lot of attention to the cover art. And a lot of the cover art we were producing just had a simple white background. And then there was, the name of the show in some sort of kind of logo type format. And over the years, we realized, man, we really need to be more intentional in making sure that the cover art for the show, the logo for the podcast, really stands out and is vibrant. So we recently shifted. I don't know how many of you all can see the mic flag on my mic, but we changed the logo of our own show, B2B Growth, to have a really vibrant, like red background color. Yeah. It's very similar, I think, to a lot of books. So if you go and look at New York Times bestsellers, the covers of their book tend to be like a blue or a red or a yellow. It stands out. And I think thinking about your podcast cover in the same way? Like, what is going to make this thing stand out? The other thing that is really, really important when you're first launching your show is optimizing for getting as many ratings as you possibly can. The reason I think ratings are so critical, Apple Podcasts prioritizes it. And a lot of people think, oh, well, I'll go and get a lot of reviews of the show. But when you go to Apple Podcasts and you look to see how they structure it, they don't show the number of reviews your show has. They show the number of ratings that your show has. And then below the ratings, which is where the stars are, they show reviews, but you just kind of scroll left to right with your thumb, and you never actually know how many reviews a show actually has. You just scroll and you can see kind of review after review. I don't think it's bad to have a few reviews there, but it's way more friction and it's way harder to get a review than it is for someone to just go and tap the number of stars they think the show deserves. So whenever you're doing your pre-recorded ad spots for your show, or whenever you're just doing it off the cuff, I would tend toward asking your listeners to, hey, go to the show on Apple Podcasts and tap the number of stars that you think the show deserves. It's really easy. They can do it in 3 seconds as opposed to having to think about what to type into a review. But when you're first getting started, ask your friends, ask family, ask your customers, ask every single person on your team. We're producing podcasts for companies that have 150, 200 employees alone. And what I like to say is you should at least have the number of employees at your company. You should at least have that many ratings of your show, because everyone on your team should be supporting this and at least giving it a quick rating.
Right.
So the other thing that I'll mention about ratings is they're a credibility indicator. Why do I want so many ratings? Is it because, Apple Podcasts will rank your show as a new and noteworthy show? Like, yeah, that will probably help. I don't think that there's huge long-term ramifications of your show being listed as a new and noteworthy show, at least not from my experience. But whenever you're going to ask people to be on the show, whether it's an author, a thought leader in the space that you really respect, or it's a decision maker at one of your target accounts, or it's an existing customer, when they go and they see that the show has 150 ratings, as opposed to like 2, which is what most podcasts have, it instantly in their mind, they think, oh, this is legit. Like, this is a legitimate thing. It's got 150 ratings. And so I think it's really important to optimize for that coming out of the gate, for the same reason as cover art too. I think your cover art communicates credibility. And I think the number of ratings your show has communicates a lot of credibility. So in terms of launch, those are 2 things that I would spend a lot of time focused on.
Anything you want to add, Joe?
I think those are great. Something that was helpful to me, and this isn't necessarily an option for everybody, but it was recommended to me and I took the advice. We knew we were going to start a podcast, and before we did, I made a conscious effort to go be a guest on other podcasts to sort of observe different host styles, to be able to pick up on little things they did that helped me prepare as a guest, that things I could then help provide to my guests to help them become more comfortable, and also just to figure out how do I want this to feel like. What were the things that really made me feel good about being on this show? So we actually, little dirty secret, we went and hired a service to help me get booked on some. There were probably 5 I wound up getting booked on my own, manufacturing or marketing podcasts, and then we hired a service to help us get booked. The company's called Interview Connections, in case anybody's out there looking for that. But it was incredibly helpful for me. And a little side benefit of that, I can attribute over 6 figures in revenue to the shows that I was a guest on. So not only was it helpful to me there, but I had 2 clients who said, "Hey, I found you on this podcast," and that's how the conversation started and turned into a client. So kind of something to help you maybe as you think about launching your own show. But I also would encourage you not to overthink it. If you're thinking about doing it, just do it.
Do it. Yeah. And yeah, it's a great point actually about getting on other podcasts. It's also a great way to go promote your podcast as well. When you have a new one, it's like, hey, like, let's go find, and there's people listening to this. There's a lot of manufacturing podcasts out there. There's Swarfcast if you're into machining. There's a couple different ones in the welding space. There's podcasts out there that aren't necessarily B2B focused, but like are talking about the topics that you are probably interested in. There's Welding Tips and Tricks podcast is the one I'm thinking of. Arc Junkies podcast, those are two in the welding space. There's some and like I said, there's some in the machining space as well. So yeah, I think those are all like really good things. The other thing to speak to you, James, and actually Jake just had a question. I want to bring this to you guys. But when you ask people to be on your show, like the first question they ask, other than how many reviews do you have, is like, how many episodes do you have? Which I think is always an interesting question. They don't ask how many listeners you have on your show, like how many people listen to it. They ask, well, how many episodes do you have? And so that brings me to Jake's question, which is a really good one. And this is all about getting started. How many episodes of content do you record before you launch your podcast? And I guess what kind of, and I have opinions on this, but I want to give you guys the floor first before I chime in.
I would say I don't think there's a perfect answer to this. I've suggested 4 in the past. I've suggested 8 in the past. Julian had a question too that I'll dovetail into this answer. He said, "What should you not focus on upfront?" And I don't know if this is exactly the kind of answer you're looking for, Julian, but I would say don't focus too much on the content being perfect. Ship it. Like if you have a thought, you have an idea, you have a POV on something, get like what Joe mentioned earlier, get your 3 or 4 talking points onto a Google Doc and just go hit record and talk through, hey, this is what I'm going to talk about today. This is why I think it's important. Boom, 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 boom. And then ship. And let feedback as you repurpose the content on LinkedIn, as you promote those episodes, let the feedback you're getting from people that comment on the LinkedIn post about it. Podcasting, you can't comment on a podcast episode. I don't know why Apple Podcasts or Spotify doesn't allow you to do that, but you can't necessarily get feedback about the episode itself natively on platforms where people are consuming it, which I think is stupid. But as you're promoting the episode, let the feedback from the people consuming it shape how you make the content better. So I see way too many people that get way too focused on making sure every episode is perfect, and it keeps them from being able to put out the volume of content that you actually need to be able to put out to really stand out from the crowd and stay top of mind for folks. So dovetailing into Jake's question of how many episodes, I think you could do 4. 4 to 8, I think, is where I would probably land there.
For me, it was about I wanted to make sure I had enough guests lined up. I wasn't so concerned about were they all recorded already. Obviously, James has many more experiences, launching podcasts with other companies, and that's even where my head's at now. Our first episode went live in late June. I think number 23 goes live tomorrow. But I'm always trying to be at least 1 month out in terms of, like, I have a date on the books with somebody and I know what the show's about, just so that I don't wind up, like, there have been a couple situations where I had a guest cancel and then there was, a holiday or something. And I wound up like getting that show in the last minute. And that just creates all this stress, and somebody pulls last minute. I just didn't want there to ever be a gap where every Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. my show goes live. So I think if you can like work a month out or so at all times and just try to stay ahead, that's a generally smart move.
And I think that doing solo episodes or maybe even some behind the curtain episodes with your team for those first few episodes would be a great way to get started too. I think launching a show with 4 solo episodes, you're not necessarily reliant on guests to make those happen. You can just ask yourself those POV discovery questions, get 4 episodes done. That's, even if it's just you behind a mic, or maybe it's you and somebody else from your team jamming on a particular idea. I think it'll help you get comfortable behind the mic. I think it'll help you practice the art of making sure that every episode has a clear POV and a point of view that you're really trying to hammer home. So it'll help you focus on that, so that when you do start doing interviews, you can help your guest really hone in on that POV and making sure that there's tangible, actionable content coming out of the episode that your listener can do something with. That's something we didn't talk about with as it relates to a successful launch. At the end of the day, the content needs to be really, really good. And I think people mistake good for there not being any ums or ahs or, not hearing a sneeze in the background. I don't measure good by that kind of stuff. I measure good by is the idea is it a transformative idea? Can somebody listen to this episode, apply it in their business and see a result? And so I think that's what the measure, to me at least, of good content is. And so I think doing a few solo episodes will help you figure that out on your own, so that then you can be a really good guide to helping your guests get there in the episodes that you do with them.
I think another tip for a successful launch, something we didn't touch on, is have distribution in mind for yourself. It's always going to post on Apple and Spotify, but think about ways you want people to get your podcast. So you'll email it out, but think about ways you can encourage your guests to also have their company distributed to their community as well. So think a lot about distribution for your content. I must harp on that on every single webinar that we do. Distribution. Figure out how you want to get your content in front of people. So when you're thinking about a launch, think about how you want to get it in front of many people as possible. Leverage LinkedIn, leverage email, leverage paid social, even if you want to like spend $25-$50 to like get that in front of people's get that in front of people's eyeballs. So my personal answer to you, Jake, is 3. I would have an intro episode and 2 guests lined up, and then I would start running. But to Joe's point, I would most definitely have a few weeks of episodes queued up. When I did the podcast at Gravy, the recurring revenue show, James, you know this because you produced that show for us, I had 18 weeks worth of content lined up because I was just like, nope, I'm all in on this and we're going to roll with it. And to not intimidate people, one thing that we didn't touch on with the podcast, and I want to get to the last slide here, is we did a lot of micro content episodes, like a lot of 5, 6, 7-minute episodes. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Those are actually some of our most listened to episodes that we've done when I did the recurring revenue show. So you don't have to have a 20 to 40-minute episode. If you can have a really good, nice and tight 5 to 8-minute episode, you should do that. Yes. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think a lot of people think it has to be long enough for it to be interesting. False. You can absolutely make a good episode in short form. And a lot of really innovative companies are experimenting with that and getting a ton of great results out of it.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah. All right. So final thoughts. You can do this. Okay. It's easy. It's not as hard as you think. To answer Julian's question, how much time should you put aside if you're looking to do this in-house? My own podcast, which averages about 45 to 50 minutes, all in, I spend approximately 15 minutes prepping for it. I spend about the 45 minutes recording it. I spend about another 30 minutes editing it, and then 10 minutes uploading it. So when you think about all that time, it's a little under 2 hours, honestly, to get an episode up. And the hardest part for you is going to be guest outreach. I think that's probably the most difficult aspect of doing podcasting. So I would start leveraging the relationships that you currently have. And I would start leveraging your sales team to get some intros for people that you want to get customers on or accounts that they want to target. Do you guys have any feedback on that?
I think that sounds about right. I mean, around 2 hours an episode plus is that 2 hours include the work that you've done for guest outreach as well, or it would be 2 hours plus guest outreach?
I do not include guest outreach in that. I look at that as almost a separate thing altogether. And I would be dedicating an hour to 2 hours a week towards guest outreach. And if you do that consistently, you're going to find yourself always with someone to interview.
Yeah. And I think the more personalized you can get with your guest outreach, the higher likelihood that someone is to say yes. So if you reach out to them and say something like, hey, I saw you, I saw an article that you wrote 6 months ago. I'd really love to have you share this, and this from that article. Are you up for it? They're way more likely to respond than if you send them an email that looks like you could have sent it to, 78 other people. So just another little tip there, that if you're only doing a weekly show, you only need to get 4 people on the show, and it shouldn't take you that long to go through and actually find a good reason for why you want them to be on the show, and make sure to include that in your outreach.
If you do those short form episodes, by the way, it's a lot less. Like
yes.
Those 10-minute episodes that I was doing at my company prior to Gorilla, those took me almost no more than 30 minutes, honestly, to get shipped. Like it was very easy, to be honest. There wasn't much editing or anything like that involved. All right, so final thoughts for people here. You can do this. Yes, it does produce ROI. There isn't going to be direct attribution. So you just got to recognize the qualitative return on investment that is going to happen, and it is not as time consuming as you think. James, Joe, I want to give you guys final thoughts as we close here for everyone. Just your final thoughts on podcasting in general for the people here. And
I think my final thoughts would be reiterating what I know you've said, and Joe actually earlier, is just start. I think you'll be blown away at all of the benefits that can come from doing this if you just pull the trigger and start. Worst case scenario, you end up doing 5 or 6 episodes and you're like, I would say you need to go past 5 or 6 episodes to really give it a fair shot. But worst case scenario, you try it and you don't like the results you're seeing. And you've still created hopefully some really good content out of it. But I think you'll be blown away at all the different ways that you can strategically leverage the show. So I would just say, just start.
Yeah, I mean, I'd reiterate that. And then, the other thing is there are people who, are on this webinar listening that are, probably either at really small organizations or maybe solopreneurs. And then there are others who are part of large organizations and have marketing resources available. And you can do a podcast on such a spectrum too. Like Matt showed you a lot of ways to do this in a really lean way. I mean, you look at, we hired Sweetfish to do it because we wanted to, put some really strong production value behind it. There's a whole spectrum. So regardless of how you want to do it, there's a way to get it done. And I think you can always start with an experiment and then, scale it up if you're seeing that it's really working well for you and you want to make it a little shinier, I guess.
Absolutely. Craig, I got your question, man. Of course, I will send you the slide deck and the link to rewatch. I have you, man. Every 2 weeks, I have you with the slide deck and the link to rewatch. I'll absolutely send that. We'll absolutely send that. All right, so I'm going to open up for questions if there are any more. But before I do want to actually plug our next session, we're going to take the week after of Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving off, and so we'll be back on December 7th, which is 3 weeks out. And we're going to actually have MJ Peters on. MJ is my podcast partner. She's the VP marketing at Firetrace. She is the smartest person in marketing that I know, and she is an expert at conducting customer interviews to use in your marketing. So she's going to come on and show you how to do that in a way that is going to give you a ton of great insight so you can work on your positioning, your content strategy, your product roadmap development. I mean, seriously, she walked me through this a couple weeks ago and absolutely blew my mind. I could not recommend you more to show up and watch that because it will be an absolute masterclass. If you guys have any more questions, we'll hang out for a few more minutes. I know we went an hour and 17 minutes. So I want to first I'll give it up to my panelists, James Carbary and Joe Sullivan. Thank you all so much for coming. Please connect with Joe and check out the guys at Sweetfish because if you want to invest a little bit in the podcasting, they're 1000% the best in the business at it. They've done this for several manufacturing shows, not just Joe's. They have another one with Todd Hockenberry. And seriously, could not recommend them enough. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think I'll just end it here. So I want to thank all y'all so much for being here. Thank you guys so much for coming every 2 weeks. I just appreciate the fact that you guys take this much time out of your day to listen to us talk about marketing, hopefully add value to your guys' day and to your guys' jobs. If you have any suggestions for topics you want us to dissect, we've reached out to some of you one-to-one. You've been awesome about that. Please reach out to Jillian or myself. We'd be happy to dive into them. We're looking to bring other people on as well to lend more credence to this and just to give you guys more value to help you able to do your jobs better. So Joe, James, thank you all so much for your time. You guys killed it. Appreciate you all so much. Thank you so much, Meredith. I appreciate that so much. And you guys have a great start to your week. Go kill it. Happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy your green bean casserole. And hopefully for some of y'all, enjoy that turducken.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
See y'all. Thank you.